Welcome back to GRD132 Typography 1 to part 3 of our kerning and tracking series that we're just kind of working with some simple logos, simple text, just to get the idea of tracking, when to use kerning, when not to use tracking, which I'll show you in just a second. A lot of times we'll use tracking to kind of tighten up headlines a little bit. So let me show you something. I moved this stuff down here, and by the way, I also saved this as EX5 because we'll probably do some kind of exercise out of this. And I called it EX5 Moravian Logos. I'm not sure what I'll call it when you guys work on it, but what I'll do now is I'll move this thing, I'll hold down my Alt key or my Option key and drag this up. And I'm going to make a headline out of this. Now I'm just going to highlight this and I'm just going to put this is a headline. Now it's going off the page here, so I'm going to take my arrow tool and just move it over. And you can see it's not very easy to read. Using tracking to read copy isn't very good at all. It's very hard to read. It's very hard for your eyes to flow from one letter to the next. It's very choppy. It breaks things up and it's very hard to read. And a lot of times what you're going to do is tighten up things, especially for a headline. Now I'm not talking body copy, I'm talking a headline. So if I go down and I put this at 0, that's going to be easier to read. And a lot of times a headline is going to be bold. So let me make this bold using that same EB font. I'll just make it bold. They have an extra bold and I'll do that. And sometimes what you actually might want to do is tighten it up a little bit more. And I'll go in here and put negative, and I'll just start really light, like negative 0.03, just to tighten it up slightly. Now that might even be a lot. So I'll try negative 0.02. And sometimes that pulls letters together a little bit nicely, especially for a headline. Your eyes pull it together. That's when you want to use tracking with headlines. You want to tighten things a little bit. Even with logos, you want to tighten them a little bit. Just like we did with the kerning down here, we tightened up the letters. So this a lot of times looks nicer with little bits of type, not with body copy. You don't want to tighten up body copy. It makes it appear too crowded. But with headlines, and also I'm going to say this is a headline, and I'm just going to hit enter here. And I'll put that spans 2 lines, and I'll put a period. Now, this is another issue with headlines, not just the tracking, but also the leading. Now, we didn't talk about leading yet, but that would be the line spacing. And the bigger you go with your point size, it increases the ratio going from baseline to baseline. So in body copy, that's a nice ratio. It looks really nice. But in headlines, they look very disconnected and disjointed, especially for just 2 lines like that. So you'd want to tighten them up. So that's also something we'll do with headlines, is not just tighten the tracking a little bit, but we will also tighten the leading. So if we go down here to line spacing, and again, they use terms like line spacing and character spacing, which the older terms, typography terms, are tracking and kerning, and then also leading, because it goes back to the metal type, the pieces of lead in between. But it's at 100% right now. I'm going to highlight in here and just go to 90, because I'm not sure how much it's going to adjust it. I mean, I know it's going to be 90% of the space, but I'm not sure of the result yet. So let me try 70 and see how that looks. Now, this looks better already, and I'm going to center it, because you would center a headline. Now, one thing you just have to watch out for that we don't have is if you had something like, if this was a G here. Now, obviously, I'm just spelling words wrong. But if you had a G here, you could see that would bump into that. And you'd have to be very careful with that. Now, if it was at the end, if you're like, oh, this is just going to be heading, that's fine, because the G kind of sits in that empty area. But you have to be very careful if there's any descenders that are going to bump into any ascenders. Now, there's no ascenders here where the S is and the E and the period, so that fits in nice, but you have to be careful with that. But this reads really nice now that we put that in there. Now, if we didn't have a G, if this was the way it was, where it said headline, we could probably even go a little tighter, but you wouldn't want to go any tighter than makes it crowded. And it's 70% right now. If you went to 60, you know, it's getting a little tight up here. There's very little room between there. You don't want it to look crowded. So that isn't something I'd recommend. You'd want to go back and probably put it at, want to go back and put it at like 70, maybe 67, something like that. Let me try 67. That's okay. But you don't want to get these too tight. You still want to make them readable, and you don't want any unnecessary space in between there to disconnect them, but you don't need to get them too tight either. So like I said, 67, 70 looked fine. That looked fine like that, but that's tightening the leading. That's the leading, the line spacing, and what we're doing here is the character spacing or the tracking. And that's just something I just wanted to point out before we talk about tracking one more time. So I'm going to go over a logo that has some bad tracking in it, and we're going to try to fix it. So we're going to do that in part 4. So part 3 actually covered leading a little bit, along with some kind of negative tracking that we are doing in here to make things a little bit tighter. So in part 4, we're going to go over some more tracking and how to fix tracking issues, especially with logos.